Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I go on to Rotary information, I would like to welcome once again, they have the pleasure to welcome the President Rotarian Anisha Dalmia and Rotarian Sudhanshu Pastia from the club secretary of the Rotary Club of Delhi Premier for joining us today. I also have the pleasure to welcome President Clive Hessel, who's actually the president of the Rotary Club of Utah in South Africa. Welcome, Clive. David Sean from Rotary Club of Scotland, who said would be joining or will be attending. Ranjit Raleigh from the US, the Rotary Club of California. Our PDG, Deepak Talwaji from the Rotary Club of Chanakyapuri. Thank you. And welcome the other members visiting and other dignitaries. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, welcome to Mr. Pramod Grover, who's the guest of the Rotarian and who has already introduced members. Now for the Rotary information. The CSR funds from the Select City Walk gives me great pleasure to inform you that the past president, Rotarian Ajay Vermaji, has organized CSR funds to the extent of nearly 4 lakhs with the support of Mrs. Neeraj Ghai of Select City Walk for the following projects, the works that we are going to be carried out. One is the setting up of yet another Rotary Club of Delhi Garden City single vocational center at Gurgaon, which includes the sewing machines, furniture, almirahs, stool, accessory, etc. as required. For information, this is our 4th sewing center, vocational center undertaken by our club. Then for the purpose of laptop projector, we'll be using the funds for projector screen, etc. for Balgram, our orphanage near Sonipat, in order to start an online vocation center. Infrastructural improvement in Srinivaspuri, Balwadi, by providing new study decks for the children, inverters, coolers, exhaust fans, etc. Once again, our various sincere thanks to Ajay for the effort made to arrange the CSR funds and further our projects and works undertaken. Undertaken. The RILM, I cannot, sorry, I've lost the page. Okay. A donation for AMC, a water filtration plant. I'm pleased to inform you that with the efforts of our dear past president, Rotarian Monica Kumar, we have received the following donation for AMC of water filtration plants at the STMC schools. From Kirti Renu Singh, rupees 2.55 lakhs. From Suraj Baksh Singh, rupees 51,000. Once again, a very sincere thanks. RILM, gives me pleasure to share some very good news. Our Rotarian Chirag Ji Jain has very kindly committed 10 to 50 lakhs towards the RILM Child Development Asha Kiran program. This will cover approximately 600 to 700 children. Basically, this program works with the NGOs in different parts of the country to put out-of-school kids back in school. It's a bridging program for dropout kids. The program was started 7 years ago and has Rotary stalwarts at its helm. Mainly Indians who have served at the Rotary International level. We thank Chiragji once again for his generous donation and salute the club for its untiring service towards the children's health and education. I'm again pleased to share with members that at Balgram, We have installed computers, bunk beds, study desks, and computer tables have been delivered there, and hoping this infrastructural improvement at Balgram will help children with a better standard of living. Single Vocational Center, a lunch celebrating Holi, was hosted by our Rotarian Kusum Chadda for the girls teachers at the Rotary Club of Delhi Garden City Single Vocational Center in Noida. They make these beautiful dresses and they're all so enthusiastic about it. The virtual fellowship, I wish to mention that our vibrant committee chairperson, Rotarian Sunita Trivedi, organized a lovely evening with Mrs. Aradhana Kohli Kapoor, who narrated along with very interesting videos on Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh, a paradise of unknown and unexplored treasures. May I request the secretary to add the Rotary to announce something or talk about the art fair? No? Okay, I shall continue. On Friday, the 9th of April, we have a very interesting speaker, Ms. Sanchita Gajpati Raju. She is a daughter of the Royal House of Vijayanagaram and is looking after schools, water conservation and dispensation program and the temple trust. On Wednesday, 21st April is our GOV, which will be 6:30 to 10:30, 6:30 to 8:30. Sorry. May I have the pleasure to welcome our chief guest speakers, the two eminent authors who will be in conversation about books, Powershift India, China Relations in a Multipolar World, India's China Challenge in the broad context of China relations. Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, PhD, and Ananth Krishnan. Welcome to us, and thank you. It's our privilege and honor to have you address us. May I request our past presidents, Rotarian Sandeep Khannaji, to please kindly do the honor of introducing their speakers to us.
Thank you, Rani Naba. So we have two eminent authors and China specialists with us today. Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh is an author, historian, and a strategist based in New Delhi. He's a founder of the North Cap University, a state private university located in Gurgaon. And he's also an adjunct fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies and a visiting fellow at the Forum for Strategic Initiative. Dr. Daulet Singh's research interests include India's foreign policy and diplomatic history, various dimensions of India-China relations, Euro-Asian geopolitics, and international political economy. He contributes to the Economic and Political Weekly, The Hindu, The Outlook, Hindustan, and soon with The Print. He has participated in several Track 2 dialogues and has addressed leading training institutions in India, including the National Defense College, Defense Services Staff College, Wellington, and the Foreign Service Institute. He was a speaker at the Jaipur Lit Fest 2021 last month. Zorawar holds a PhD in International Relations from King's College London, an MA from the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, and a BSc from the University of London, where he majored in economics and finance. His recent books include India-China Relations, The Border Issue and Beyond, Chasing the Dragon, Will India Catch Up with China? And Power and Diplomacy, India's Foreign Policies During the Cold War. Now we come to the next eminent speaker, Mr. Ananth Krishnan. He's reported from China for 9 years. He's the Beijing correspondent for The Hindu. He was previously the Beijing-based associate editor at the India Today Group. In 2019, he was a visiting fellow at Brookings India and Asia Global Fellow at the University of Hong Kong. His reporting in China has taken him to all but 3 of China's 33 provinces and regions. His interests include India-China relations, as well as Tibet, Xinjiang, and ethnic minorities in China. Ananth, who is from China, reads and speaks Mandarin. He holds a master's degree in social science from the University of Chicago and bachelor's degree in history and economics from the University of California, LA. Many thanks to Zorawar for inviting Ananth to join us for our club's first conversation between two eminent authors. And thank you, Ananth, for accepting the same. Now, may I request you, Ananth, to take over and start the conversation with Zorawar in the broader context of India-China relations, about your respective books, Zorawar's Powershift, India-China relations in a multipolar world, and your India's China challenge in all its aspects, economic, diplomatic, and military. And then we can have a Q&A after that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
A unique event.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Zorawar, for arranging this. Really appreciate it. A pleasure to be here. And Zorawar, as I told you offline, in case for whatever reason, if I'm not audible, just let me know. Since I'm joining you guys from Chennai, I'm usually based in Beijing, but because of COVID-19, I've kind of been marooned here for the last 12 to 14 months, still waiting for a visa to go back to China, which should happen later this year. So I'm joining, very warm welcome to all of you from Chennai. So what Zorawar and I thought we would do is have a casual chat for the next 30 minutes or so, and then give a lot of time for you guys to come in with your own questions. I'm sure you have a lot of questions on China. It's been, I think, a relationship and an issue that we've all been paying a lot of attention to the last year for two obvious reasons. First, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, and the second being the border crisis between India and China that actually in many ways is still ongoing. So we aren't really going to be giving you book talks, but kind of talk about themes that we both discuss in our books. I have to say, first of all, I really enjoyed your book. I think for any student of history, student of China, Powershift really gives you a macro picture of how often even relations between the two countries are shaped by global events through history. And I think that my book kind of gives you another ground perspective of China. Thank you, sir. Gives you a ground perspective from China based on my reporting there. So a kind of very micro view, and he gives you this fantastic macro view. I really think they complement each other. And I think we probably should get Amazon to kind of bundle our books and sell them. But what we're going to do over the next 30 minutes is look at China, what is happening in China right now under Xi Jinping, look at the India-China relationship, where it's at, where it's going, and kind of try and give you guys a global picture of what is going on with the new administration in Washington. What does that mean for US-China relations after this whole Trump period? And what does all that mean for India, which is, of course, is what all of us want to know. So I think if we begin by just looking at the last couple of weeks, I think for people who've been reading the news and following diplomacy, it's been a really interesting couple of weeks. On March 12th, you had, as I'm sure most of you have read in the newspapers, the first virtual summit of the four leaders of the grouping now known as the Quad, which is India, United States, Australia, and Japan. And 7 days after that, you had a really high-level summit meeting between US and Chinese officials in Alaska. And that was really the first big conversation that America and China have had after the big change in government, the very difficult election, and all the kind of acrimony that followed after Donald Trump lost. So I think it's really brought to the fore this whole India-China-US dynamic. That's where I want to begin this conversation today. Zorawar, I think something that people in India are often reading in the papers is that how do we balance our relationship with America, where we have very close security ties, some economic problems with America over trade, but still a solid relationship. And on the other hand, we have this neighbor China, very difficult relationship, but at the same time, a country with which we share a border and we have to live with them. As they say about neighbors, you can't wish them away. So looking at your own research over the last few decades, you kind of see history repeating itself in terms of how these three countries are kind of dealing with this triangular dynamic. I think people would love to hear that to get us started today.
Thank you, Ananth. Thanks so much. By the way, to everyone, Ananth and me connected, in fact, in my first trip to China in 2009. And we've come a long way since then in terms of this relationship, and just the entire world order's gone through. I mean, that was just after the global economic crisis, Ananth, if you recall. And there was just a new sort of perspective coming out from Asia, where you had many rising powers, China, India, others, that were getting a little more impatient with how things were going in globalization. The existing institutions were not being able to accommodate these powers. So I think the period of the last 10 years has seen, in a sense, China racing ahead, but you also have a lot of China's neighbors also up there as well. So I think one of the themes we'll bring out today is that this story about China's rise is actually a much more wider story about Asia, in a sense, returning to a place that it held for possibly 1800 of the last 2000 years. So that's the big macro kind of context. When you look at this US, United States, India, China triangle, we sometimes sort of look at contemporary events as if it's happening for the first time. But as historians, political scientists, analysts, we always try to sort of find patterns that have happened in the past, because those patterns might help us to frame better policy, might help us to understand where different countries are coming from. So the perspective that I've taken is that you had a new situation that really came in after 1947. The partition of India created, in a sense, two powerful neighbors. Pakistan at the time was, of course, much weaker, but it was propped up by NATO. So you had such a different environment that we have been dealing with in the last 70 years, which is very different from anything that the Indian subcontinent, in a sense, handled for the previous millennia, so to speak. You had previously only internal challenges, Ananth, in a sense. Now you've been sort of, there's been this sense of an encirclement around you. And I think one interpretation of India's foreign policy could be that breaking out of this encirclement over these several decades has been, I think, possibly one of the core functions of how Indian policymakers have tried to sort of navigate this world. So, when I look at, let's say, the India-US relationship, we've sort of want to pick up the last 10 years and say that it's something new. But when I look back at the 50s, the late 50s, actually 1957, is in fact the first moment where India and US are beginning to sort of connect after a period of sort of mutual mistrust, suspicion, and where Mao's China at the time, which is going through its own internal convulsions and is breaking free of its alliance with the Soviet Union. So this is the period where India and America kind of have their first go at trying to build some sort of an understanding on China. And 62, of course, happens, and a tragic conflict, and it actually further advances Indo-US ties, but it doesn't take it to what many felt should have happened. And one of the reasons that when we look back at the past is that the United States has always viewed China independently from its relationship with India. It values China as an important player in Asia. It is in fact valued it as a potential commercial prize going back from the 19th century, the so-called Great Game and the race to scramble for access to what was then the largest economy in the world. So I think that continuity remains till this day. And when you look at even the Trump administration, despite all the kind of competition and trade war, let's call it a trade war or a trade struggle that it waged, it wasn't able to really change the outlook of American companies and businesses who I think still remain deeply engaged with China. So I think there's this running strand where the mercantile or commercial sort of outlook still is very, very strong. So for us in India, when we look at the Biden administration, I mean, let's not forget, I think I'm sure many of our audience today would recall this famous 2-hour conversation that Joe Biden had with Xi Jinping maybe a month ago. Ananth, is that true?
Right.
So,
Yep, that's true.
so that kind of gave us a sense, and I think in India that we need to sort of look at what's happening around it, and let's not get pulled in a particular direction really, really fast. So I think that was maybe I've sort of dragged on a bit longer than you hoped, but yeah. So back to you.
There's one interesting thing, Zorawar, that you mentioned at the start of your answer, which I thought was worth flagging, which is you mentioned how the rise of China and the rise of India is something that's been happening parallelly. And the funny thing is, I think a lot of people who follow the India-China relationship, because we in the media tend to cover a lot of the boundary issues and things like that. But the funny irony is actually, if you look at global issues, in many ways, our views are more closely aligned with China's in terms of wanting a fair share for developing countries, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on trade, whether it's on intellectual property rights. So it's quite interesting where on the bilateral side, we have all these issues with China, but then when you look at global macro issues, in many ways, they have more similar positions because of their similar status as developing countries and a very different view from the West. Before we do get into internal dynamics of China, which I'm happy to share my thoughts on, Zorawar, one interesting point is this whole idea of non-alignment, which has been a consistent trend of India's thought, the fact that we have an independent foreign policy. And even now, when you're talking about the Quad, you're talking about India doing much more things with US, Japan on the security side. That hasn't changed. And I think even the Narendra Modi government has made it very clear. A small example is the fact that we've made it very clear to America that we have very close ties with Russia, and we won't compromise those close ties with Russia. For instance, we are going ahead with this huge deal for the S-400 missile defense systems, even though the US has threatened to put sanctions on us. So in many ways, even though we're moving closer to the US, would you say that that kind of fundamental principle of Indian foreign policy, that we see ourselves as a big power, as an independent power, we don't want to constrain ourselves by putting us in one camp? Do you say that that still broadly holds? Or do you think that because of this huge US-China rivalry that we're now seeing every country kind of dragged into, is that going to be difficult for us to continue with that independent sort of foreign policies? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, that's one of the biggest questions of the last decade, so to speak, that how does China's rise change this outlook of wanting to be an independent power? But I would say that this idea of manifest destiny, that India has claims to being something on the Asian stage, I think the only way you could do that is remaining as this aspiring to be this great power. But that doesn't exclude having very deep relationships and security partners. Let's put it this way, when you look at China, it has 14 neighbors, in a sense, 14 land neighbors. And then, so each of those, in a sense, are an opportunity for India to develop deep ties with them. So I think the challenge has been to how do you actually deepen ties with them, especially when many of them are several thousand miles away. I think if he could mute folks,
if those of you who aren't speaking could mute yourselves, great. And once we come to the Q&A, of course, you could unmute. Sorry, Zorawar, continue.
Yeah. So when I look at, let's say, this possibility of US-China competing more sort of fiercely in the coming decades, which is possibly likely, to what extent it manifests is still very, very much undetermined, and it might not be like what we saw in the First Cold War. That's what seems at the moment, because I don't think neither China or America are in a position to wage that kind of a global titanic struggle, because they just have so many problems at home. There's so many unfulfilled reasons to sort of move forward. So I think your broad theme is that the Modi government has taken us to a new direction, but it hasn't still abandoned the basic morals of Indian foreign policy, where you still want to sort of be this power in Asia that is respected. And I think if you want to be respected by others, not just China, but your own neighbors and China's neighbors, you do have to portray yourself as having a mind of your own. So I think that still remains quite valid. Ananth, I think maybe let's move to giving folks an insight into your experience, because you have a lived experience in China. And I think the kinds of perspectives and and folks that you have interacted with, from policymakers to journalists to students across provinces. I think it's so rich. I think you've covered every single province you've traveled except. Is there anyone
I have
that?
3. Yeah, I do have 3 that I haven't been to yet. So that's top
Which
of
is
my list
phenomenal,
when I go back.
In
So,
fact, I urge everyone to follow Anand's work, because he's one of the few. In fact, it's such a pity that the Indian media and the government don't invest as much in terms of correspondents who actually spend time and speak the language. And for us in Delhi and in India, that this gives us at least an independent, authentic insight into Chinese perspectives, rather than just relying on the Economist or the Financial Times or mainstream Western media, which can at times become prejudiced and biased and view the world through their lenses. So I think that's something which we can go much deeper in. So one theme, Ananth, that I think many of our audience today and generally is mystified is, or would like to understand, is the rise of Xi Jinping changing China in any major significant way? What is there a continuity? Is there a big radical shift? How do you see it?
No, it's a great question, Zorawar, and I think that it's quite interesting that I think there's no doubt Xi Jinping is making a huge change in how China sees its position in the world. But I think if we take a step back and look at the kind of trends and the context in which he came to power in 2012, I think I've been thinking about this quite a bit. And my takeaway would be that if it wasn't Xi, it would be somebody else, in the sense that it's more structural rather than one personality changing things. It's more structural, a result of many of the things that you said. So I moved to China first in 2008, and many of you will remember that's when the Olympics happened in Beijing. And it was interesting to be there as an outsider, because there's this huge sense of pride, and they saw the Olympics as marking their kind of, announcing their entry to the world in a very visceral way. And then you had this kind of double whammy. You had the Olympics in 2008, and the next year you had the global financial crisis, which created this big, very deep sentiment in China that I think is so prevalent today, that the decline of the West had begun. And I think that those two events had really changed the way they viewed their relationship with the world. And I think it began creating this feeling that this was now their time. So that's why I feel if it wasn't Xi Jinping in 2012, I think no matter who came to power, they were going to change the way China exercises its relationship with the world. The fact that it had become the world's second largest economy, the fact that its military is now second only to the US. So I do believe that if it wasn't him, it would be somebody else. But having said that, I think where he's really changed China, less so I feel with its external relations with the world. I think China was going to become more assertive regardless. But I think where he's really changed things is internally. And for me personally, one of the big changes is actually, it's difficult to imagine now, but when I first moved there, it was actually a time of opening up. It was great to be a reporter there in 2008, 2009, because people were really happy to tell their stories to you. They felt that after, the reforms began in China in 1978, but they still felt that even up in the early 2000s, that there was this wall between them and the rest of the world. So I actually encountered so much warmth from people who wanted to share their stories. The government was loosening up controls on the media in China. You're actually getting private media as much as private as you can be in China. Chinese social media, Twitter and Facebook and YouTube were all banned in 2009 when I first moved there. But you had these Chinese equivalents that were being monitored and censored, but they were still thriving places of debate. But then when I look back at the China that I left in 2018, I have a feeling that the last 4 or 5 years has actually seen a regression. You had this huge trend of them moving towards openness, but I think where Xi Jinping has really changed things is putting like a halt to that trend and taking things in the other direction in terms of how much freedom there is in university campuses, how much freedom there is in the media, in domestic media in China. I think all of that is now regressing, which is one sad thing. The other quick point, Zorawar, that I think is useful for us to know when we look at, for instance, Chinese foreign policy, Chinese diplomacy, one thing she has really brought back to the fore is the idea of national rejuvenation. Now, that's something that Chinese leaders have been talking about for a really, really long time, and we can go back into that. But as soon as he took over in 2012, his signature campaign was called the China Dream. And the China Dream was basically giving people a better life at home, but abroad, having this strong China, this rejuvenated China, one that in his words comes back to this, the Middle Kingdom, center stage of the world. So that's something that I think is really influencing their foreign policy as well now, the way they deal with us, the way they deal with India. They very much see themselves as being in this elite bracket with the United States. And you see that in the way they're acting out with their neighbors. You see that in the way they're coming up with these big initiatives like the Belt and Road. So I think it's, in that sense, I think under Xi, you are seeing a very, very new phase of China's behavior.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel, Ananth, that this ambition of China is sort of timed, as in the idea is that, are they ready for it now, or are they sort of trying to punch beyond what they can do today? Is it because, if as we know historically, there've been cycles where earlier rising powers like Japan, Germany, and that's the analogy many, will this similarly lead to that kind of a confrontation, or are the Chinese cautious and prudent in how they're going to handle it? What's your perspective?
I think the worrying thing is, if you are somebody in Beijing, I think what would worry you is, I think they've abandoned the caution, the prudence, the long-term thinking that served them very well. I think they've abandoned that because now they are so suffused with this sense that this is their time. If I can just give you a very specific example of recent days. So you would think that China had a great opportunity with this change in America from Trump to Biden. All of us know that America is divided internally. America is still dealing with the pandemic. And you saw China trying to reach out to Europe, for instance, and trying to weaken the US Europe transatlantic alliance. Earlier this year, they signed this big investment treaty with Europe. But then what did they go ahead and do the last week? The last week, they've launched this huge nationalistic campaign at home against all foreign brands, including all European brands, or like the Zara's, H&M's, even Burberry's. There's a huge national campaign now in China saying that, these are anti-national brands. And the reason for that is because of the fact that all of you may have seen that there's lots of attention on what's happening in Xinjiang, which is a Muslim majority province in Western China. Now, some of the Western countries pointed out that under Xi Jinping over the last 3-4 years, there's been a huge security clampdown in Xinjiang, including this huge sort of campaign where they moved hundreds of thousands of people into these re-education centers. And later it emerged that these re-education centers were producing cotton that was being used by Adidas, H&M, Nike. Well, these companies pledged to join a Western Better Cotton Initiative. And that's created so much anger in China, where now there's a huge pushback against everything foreign, everything European. And the first casualty of that is going to be the China-Europe deal. So I think that's just to give you a small example, Zorawar, of the fact that it's so difficult for them to be as effective a power as they can be, as strategic a power as they can be, when on the other hand, domestically, they've unleashed all of these feelings of nationalism, the sense of this is our time. And I think you've seen that with India as well. I think we should talk a little bit about that, where you would think this is a great time for them to build better relations with India while a US-China rivalry is going on. So what exactly happened last year is kind of pushed India in the opposite direction. And I think that goes back to your question, are they being prudent or are they flexing muscles perhaps a bit too early?
So Ananth, I think this is one question that everyone in India would love to know. I mean, I know there are probably many layers to this, but what do the Chinese think about India and about Indians? Maybe that's two separate constituencies.
Yeah. So to be honest, that was a question that motivated me to write my book. And what I kind of wanted to show in my book is the fact that I don't want to sound really glib, but the short answer to your question is it depends who you ask. Where I think there's a huge variety. What really surprised me coming to China is there's such a huge variety of opinion that you don't really imagine coming there. And I think the big reason is because often it can't be expressed in the sense that you have a party-controlled media environment, et cetera, et cetera. But I found that there's such a divergence of views generationally. People who are born in the 60s and 70s tend to have very, very different views than those born in the 80s, 90s, time of prosperity. Similarly, in terms of the way they look at India, the biggest thing that struck me was anyone who's above 50 years old in China has this tremendous love of Indian cinema, Indian film. And it's interesting because when they grew up in the Cultural Revolution, China did not allow any foreign films. The only foreign films that Mao allowed were Indian films and Russian films. And they allowed Indian films such as like Raj Kapoor's films because if you go back and watch those films, they have a very sort of message of kind of, some would say, socialist message of equality, of a guy coming from the countryside to the city, and the kind of themes that appeal to people in China who are going through the similar changes back then. Everybody in China who's above 50 is mad about Raj Kapoor, and every time I'm on a taxi in Beijing, they will sing you those songs. And then if I come to present day, the thing that strikes you about people born in the 80s and 90s is they aren't very much interested in politics. I'm making huge generalizations here, Zorawar, and I try to bring out complexities in my book where I do speak to young Chinese who are involved in political, civil society initiatives, who are involved in NGOs. I'm giving you a very broad picture here, so please excuse my generalizations. But I say people are not very aware of the political problems between India and China. I think they're more aware of the biggest thing is Indian film. Amir Khan is, for example, perhaps the most popular non-Chinese actor in China. They're very interested in yoga. I think there are more yoga institutes in Beijing than there are in Delhi. Honestly, it's not an exaggeration. Every street, literally, you'd see that. And I think there's Indian culture has a huge draw in China. And I think people are less sort of motivated by political events. That's not to say that I'm not underplaying the political problems. It's a whole different set of problems we have to deal with. But just in terms of public opinion, it's quite interesting that I don't see the animosity, the feelings that they usually have, for instance, towards the Japanese because of the legacy of the Japanese occupation of China. Even the feelings that they have towards Americans because of this whole China-US rivalry. You don't see that with India at all, which is something that I found very interesting moving there.
In fact, that's fascinating, Anand, because one of the things, even going back to a century ago, when you had this pan-Asian movement, Chinese intellectuals used to actually talk about how their civilization, their language, their culture drew so much from India over 2,000 years.
For sure, yeah.
And it's the colonial sort of period of India's subjugation, in a sense, that kind of broke that cultural respect, or which I think is still there, but they kind of lost confidence in what India could have been. So I think part of the struggle, I mean, maybe now we are moving into philosophical, but one of the biggest challenges, I think, for policymakers in India and even intellectual and people is to restore that confidence, both for ourselves and others, that we are going to be this independent power in a sense of the future. Because I think they have this suspicion that you're going to,
for sure,
you're going to sort of lose yourself again in some kind of a bigger great game. So I feel that there's something deeper happening there. But
no, and I should add really quickly, Zorawar, I gave you the good view. Of Chinese views towards India, but there is another strand to that, and I think we should acknowledge that as well. Something that you mentioned in the early 20th century, when Rabindranath Tagore, in the 1920s, he went on this huge tour of China, and he was welcomed. Thousands of people went to attend to his lectures, and to this day, every Chinese school student reads Tagore in school. And I can tell you, during my entire school in Chennai, we did not read. I mean, such is the curriculum in India where we read Tamil poets, but we did not read much of Tagore in Chennai. But every Chinese school student actually reads Tagore seriously. But having said that, Tagore was welcomed by people who shared this civilizational view, the fact that he represented the power of Eastern civilization, the fact that he became the first Asian Nobel laureate was welcomed in China because they felt proud that Tagore became a Nobel laureate. But he also triggered another kind of view in China, which was some of the leading Chinese intellectuals at the time, including Chen Duxiu, who founded the Communist Party of China, said this is dangerous because the last thing we want is to learn from India, because India was subjugated as a colonial power. And so they felt that the only way China can rise is to learn from the West. And in many ways, however, I think that strand is still persisted, where if you look at Chinese newspapers, they kind of don't like this India-China, equation, India-China hyphenation. It really makes them very, very annoyed. And they say that, and that's why even I think a bad trend for the India-China relationship is increasingly many people in China, strategic thinkers in China, they don't look at dealing with India in our own right. They look at India within the larger sort of China-US sort of equation. And I think that's an unfortunate thing. I completely endorse your point that there needs to be this sense of dealing with each other, maybe not on an equal footing. Let's be realistic, there's a power gap, but at least dealing with each other without this prism of another relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think maybe we should sort of segue into, I think the other theme that's been in the minds of folks is this major border crisis that
For sure. And before we get into that, Zorawar, I want to encourage everyone to, please feel free to type in the chat box any questions you have. And if you type it in, then we can come to you and call on you. And we'd love to hear from all of you, ideally in person. So if you do have questions, please start typing away in your chat box and we'll come to you. Yeah, sorry, Zorawar. Yeah.
No, I said the Ladakh crisis kind of sense was the sort of a crossroads moment where you have Indians and Indian leaders rethinking what kind of relationship that they can build with China. And moment you sort of play out the scenarios, you always end up with some sort of a recognition that it can't sort of go into extreme scenarios, right? You still have to deal with your neighbor. You still have to deal with somebody who's much stronger than you, who's around you, but you have to still find ways to secure your interests. So I often, one of the themes that I would like sort of to suggest to policymakers is that maybe we need to do a little bit with China, what China did with the United States during their period of rise, 4 decades. Is that something we should leverage and can? So those are themes out there. In terms of the border dispute as such, is there anything in particular that strikes you which is different from, let's say, the period of the earlier? So because we have the 50s where you had a legacy of an unresolved frontier, and many of the points of confrontation, even last year, go back to areas or pockets that were there from even in the late 50s. And so there is this sense of almost like a dispute that's frozen in time, and then it keeps erupting. And the last year's eruption was this sort of, do you feel that this could have led to a war last year?
I would love to hear your view on that as well, and I'll flip that back to you. But I do think that I genuinely do think that that the relationship last year was extremely worrying, and I would say that the Northern Army Commander, Lieutenant General Joshi, gave an interview a few months ago where he did say that at the end of August that both of them had really come to the brink of war, in the sense that you had a situation where you had artillery deployed, you had tanks like this, and literally by God's grace, nothing happened. But all it would have taken was one error by somebody, a young chap from either side on the ground, and it could have escalated. Frankly, I think the reason why they are now disengaging and trying to move back is neither wanted that situation. And I think that for me, Zorawar, that covering this relationship for the last 10 years, sometimes it just feels how it's so cyclical, It's you have crisis, then you have this realization that the costs are too dangerous, let's try and make amends. 2017 Doklam crisis happened. Then they both realized, let's get together, and you had Prime Minister Modi go to China in 2018. You had President Xi come to Chennai in 2019. And then again, 2020, you have another crisis. I think this crisis is much more serious than Doklam because of the fact that it's in multiple places, because of the fact that the big difference from past crises was you had a big number of troops deployed, and it's going to take a lot of time, I think, for them to go back to their peacetime position. In that sense, I think it's going to take a lot of time for the relationship to come back to normal. My personal view, you may say this is a naive view, is that ultimately you're kicking the can down the road. You really got to have a serious conversation about settling the dispute. And I think it will require give and take on both sides. And I think that the big unfortunate thing for me is I don't think people neither here nor there are willing to have a conversation about give and take. I don't know what you think, Zorawar, but I generally feel that until you settle this thing is going to keep repeating again and again, because you have this undemarcated border, troops patrolling. There's no way around it the way I see it.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we forget today, I mean, in the general discourse, which is outside these very, very small communities of historians who still might sort of know the facts, is that this idea that this frontier, uh, I mean, when you go back to the 62 war, I think there were definitely opportunities to solve this question.
No, for sure, yeah.
Not about that. And I think we missed our chance there. And then we missed it again when China undertook this massive post-Mao reconception of its place in the world. When Deng Xiaoping comes in and opens up, and again, he makes this offer to settle in 1979 to Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Then again in 1980, it's made to Indira Gandhi. So this idea that this dispute can be settled, I think the Chinese have had moments when they've taken it seriously, when they wanted to.
Yeah.
The reasons for those could be to do with maybe they were facing problems on other fronts, or maybe they just wanted peace and stability to focus on domestic issues. So certainly after Deng Xiaoping comes in, I think Chinese wanted to just calm down the international or regional environment to focus on economic growth in a sense. Again, at that point, we missed it. And then the third opportunity, I think, comes around 2004, 2005, when the Chinese sort of make a, maybe not as concerted as the previous one, where they try and sort of nudge India to sort of look at the resolution of the dispute. But that again kind of never really took off. So I feel this model that the border dispute should be settled is of course a great one, but I don't see it in practice playing out.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
for many years to come, because there's this mismatch of expectations that I think from the Chinese side, which they keep writing about, that if we settle the frontier with India, what is the guarantee that India will be a neighbor that can be sort of will become something that they can understand and trust. And the same way goes for us, right? In a sense that if we were to make a concession with China, what's the guarantee that they will give up on Pakistan and focus more on us? So there's no way to sort of bridge this. And the only alternative has been this model that both the countries have been following for the last 30 years, is that if you can't solve your problems, then you maintain some sort of civility, keep peace on the frontier, but also start incrementally learning more about each other and start doing trade, economy, etc. So I don't know if that model is going to be tossed aside, because the alternative is, the only two alternatives to this, there is outright confrontation and competition, or solving your problems. So I think we end up with more or less a continuity where you're going to sort of play along with the old model, but adjust it on the margins in a sense, because the alternatives, I don't think the Modi government or Xi Jinping wants to get into a outright confrontation, and neither can they solve this problem. So I think we're stuck somewhere, and I don't know what's going to change it. So
I think that in your book you have this really good phrase, which I think is our audience might like. I think in a nutshell, it sums up the relationship the way Zorawar suggests, which he calls competitive but peaceful coexistence. I completely endorse that. I think, Zorawar, can we take some questions if that's fine with you? I see a lot of questions. Manmohan Bhagat, can you pose your question? I see a very sharp questions from you. May I invite you to please unmute yourself and pose your question? Are you here?
Hi, by the way, I should have changed the name. That's my father's.
All right, I'm sorry. Okay. All right.
You shouldn't be. We've left it there. And that's my mom's Samini. So I have a few questions. As you can see, I'm very keen to know what happened in the US-China meet in Alaska. Biden has merely postponed leaving Afghanistan. I believe it gives China a huge opportunity, because they're already very active in Iran and in Pakistan, knowing that Afghanistan is landlocked. Afghanistan has, of course, closest to India, our closest neighbor, which has the most valuable rare earth elements and lithium and so on. So it's very vital for China, I think, to take more control of these resources. So I'd like to know what you think. Quad has been born and disappeared and been reborn, and in true Hindu style, reborn yet again. do you think it's got enough substance now to survive, thanks to genuine fears of China? And my last question, please. We're all focused, rightly so, on physical incursions by China. Of course, by the way, China views us as a threat. I'd like you gentlemen who know history to enlighten us on some of India's historical incursions into China, as well as India's support for Tibet, which the Chinese therefore view as a fail, something on their part anti-India. We are always focused on the physical. I think in today's world, we need to look at the cyber threat that China poses. So I'd really like you gentlemen's question.
Four fantastic questions. No, thank you so much. All four, I think, are superb questions. Zorawar, I will attempt Alaska and Quad. I leave Afghanistan and the last one to you, since I think that your area of expertise more than it is mine. May I request you guys to mute so I could just answer that? Okay. So on Alaska, I think I can hear a little bit of. May I request you all to mute? I can hear a bit of. Okay, I'll go ahead. In Alaska, I think that from my understanding, it was just a meeting about, I think, both sides wanting to kind of draw the red lines for the other. And I think that it was because of the fact that you had these really 4 difficult years in US-China relations under Donald Trump. And I think that the new administration kind of in Washington invited the Chinese officials to come. I think they wanted to give a couple of really clear messages. I think the first message that they wanted to give was, this is not going to be a return to Obama, where the emphasis was on America and China working together and cooperating, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the Biden administration is going to surprise people by carrying on a lot of what Trump did with China. And I think on record, members of the Biden administration have said that they think many of the things that Trump did were actually right in terms of the way he framed the China challenge. So I think that that's good. That's one message. I think that the Chinese, for their part, also wanted to draw red lines. And their red lines were pretty much saying that they won't accept any kind of interference when it comes to their internal affairs, such as Xinjiang or Tibet or Taiwan. So I think it was more about drawing red lines. And I think it was more about, I think, firefighting and not an ambitious agenda of cooperating. A very initial get to know you kind of meeting is what it was. Zorawar, do you want to weigh in on Afghanistan and cyber?
Yeah. So I think on Afghanistan, when the roots of that conflict were obviously this struggle between the United States and the Russians going back to the 70s. So, and China was actually on the American side during that. So, and in some sense, because of the relationship that the Chinese have with the Pakistan, especially the Pakistan Army and the intelligence services, which also has this deep relationship with the US Pentagon and US military, I think it's a kind of more complicated picture. So I don't see this sense of competition between the United States and China inside Afghanistan, because for the last 20 years of this war, this latest phase of the Afghan conflict, you will not see China.
Hold on, Zara. I think there's somebody here who needs to mute. Okay, we're good. Yeah,
I think it's
go
fine.
ahead.
Yeah, I think China has not really played a destabilizing role from the American perspective. I think the Americans usually look at the Chinese as folks that can support the Pakistan side of the equation. I think where the Chinese are looking out is, where will this long-term American presence be in Afghanistan? And from whatever we are seeing from the Biden administration and previously, that I think that period of holding on to a large, massive base is now losing traction. So I don't think the American people or the American military is really interested in that. So I think what the Chinese are going to do is they're going to just keep the ball rolling, not allow the Americans to entrench themselves in a powerful position. But at the same time, they will not because ultimately it's their allies, the Pakistan army, that has deep interest in Afghanistan. I think the Chinese support that. So we are kind of stuck outside that, where our allies there, in a sense of who we used to ally with, we've kind of lost that ground, whether it was the Northern Alliance and Central Asia and Iran. So until we develop ties, in fact, with a lot of those countries, only then can we re-enter Afghanistan from at least a position of some sort of leverage, because otherwise you'll always be on the outer circle. I think that other question was interesting, this idea that looking back at what were the Indian incursions, or perhaps the British Indian incursions into these northern frontiers, right? So I think the most famous one was, of course, it happened through the 19th century, where the entire sub-Himalayan space was gradually brought into the British orbit, right, from Sikkim, Bhutan, Nepal, and then actively intervening in Tibet in 1904, the famous Young Husband expedition. So, and by the way, our interest in Tibet and our presence in Tibet lasted right up till 1954, where our agreement on Tibet with China, where we finally abandoned many of our positions and assets there, which were actually built by the British. So I think there's definitely an interesting story out there to be told of why is this frontier the way it is, the shape of the frontier, why are these points so important? Because the British were looking at those areas to not only just bring them into the Indian orbit, they were also looking at trade routes, because they had one from the South China Sea. So there was a different consciousness there. And I think part of the problem in India has been that we just inherited many of those ideas and didn't really adapt them. There was a brief period where in the 50s, we kind of said, can we do something different? But that part never really took off. And it's not easy, because you're dealing with China that doesn't entertain in their mind any kind of compromise on what they see as their periphery. So there is this sense of a legacy, but I think we will do good. And as Indians, if you were to look at why this frontier is the way it is, why are parts undefined? They were deliberately left undefined because ambiguity at that time suited the British, because they could move in and out, So our requirements changed after 1947, after 1962, and we have there needs to be a deep historical sort of reflection, and we don't see that. So
Zorawar, I think what we'll do now, since we're already running past time, is I'm going to read out the remaining questions, and I think you and I can have a final word before our hosts wrap up, because of the interest of time. Is that fine with you?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks.
So I'll just read out the questions, and then you can give your final summing up thoughts, and maybe you can answer the question on cyber as well, and then I'll give my rounding up thoughts. I think there's a question from Vikram Bajaj, who says, there's no affinity between the people of India and China, but that does not preclude rising tensions. What does the Chinese leadership think of our leadership today? Great question. I'm happy to take that. Sandeep Khanna also asked on cyber. Zorawar, I think you could take the cyber one. Anil Sani asks, why is India unable to drastically reduce dependence on China? I think it's a question everybody in the government is thinking about as well. Ajay Mehra says, are temporary overtures reliable and dependable, seeing the wars on and off? I think I'll leave that to you. Harshit has a question on the power differential between only option is external balancing. And I think I will give a shot at that, then I'll give the final word to you, Zorawar. Is that fine with you?
Sure, go ahead.
So to the question about, I think it's a great point Vikram makes, that there is affinity, and I think there's a very strange irony here, where I would say public opinion in China towards India is really positive, but the irony is public opinion matters much less. So it doesn't really, it could be a greater positive influencer in the relationship, but given China's system, it's less of a factor, I would say. And I think obviously it does not preclude political problems between countries, and the Chinese government is fairly adept, as we saw after the Galwan Valley clash. They're fairly adept at turning on this nationalist sentiment by mobilizing public opinion in Chinese media towards India and then turning it off. So the Chinese government does play a role in kind of shaping public opinion and trying to use it as an asset when they see fit in terms of what the Chinese leadership thinks of India's leadership today, I wish I knew. I don't know what the Chinese leadership thinks, but I think that the big debate that you see reflected in the Chinese official press, which I suppose is one lens to look at the leadership, is India going into the US camp or not? How do they deal with India? The dilemma they face is, how do they prevent India from trying to exploit the China-US tensions, but at the same time without pushing India into the US camp? I would say in a nutshell, that's kind of the dilemma that they are trying to address. Meg says, I've lived in China between 2007 and 2016. If I recall, Meg, I think we met. If it's the same Meg. He says, how do you read China's recent positive overtures towards the Indian National Congress? Yes, I think this is Meg from NIIT. I hope you're well. I haven't really seen positive overtures to the Indian National Congress, so I'm not entirely sure. And I do think that, from my understanding, regardless of the government in power in India, they will work with them. I don't think the Chinese really have a great preference between the BJP or Congress, the way I see it. Over to you, Zorawar, for the last word.
Mm-hmm. So I'll briefly sort of pick up this idea of cyber and maybe this digital space that we talk about. So I think the way I look at it is that the India's entire footprint in the digital economy and social media is already non-Chinese in a sense. We're on Facebook, Amazon, Twitter. So we are already on international Western networks, so to speak. So which may be vulnerable to the Chinese, but we don't have our own internal. So one of the things is this idea of data sovereignty or creating some sort of an Indian ecosystem. I think that's something which is a welcome development, but it's of course very expensive to develop your own app platforms. But that's what the Chinese have done to secure themselves. So I think that's where this trade-off between privacy, national security, and providing some sort of creative freedoms to Indian citizens. I think that's a broader discussion that Indians need to have amongst themselves. Because if you want security and some sort of national security, then you've got to develop your platforms indigenously, the way the Chinese have done, because they premium that part more than creative expression and individualism. I think this idea of how do we sort of keep the Chinese economic footprint in a more manageable way, I would sort of put this question that if you look at every major economy today, they have pretty deep and extensive linkages with China, from Japan to Korea, to Russia, to Vietnam, to Southeast Asia, to the United States, to Europe, running into sort of areas which are far higher than what India and China have been able to do. So, and I think those economic linkages also provide leverage to these countries with China. It works both ways, right? The moment you engage deeply with another state, you have to give up some influence, but you also gain some on the other. So I would actually argue the problem with India and China is the opposite, that you have to develop ties in certain areas. Now you can choose the sectors where you want to sort of go deeper. Maybe there's some parts which you feel you should not, because those are areas that you want to develop your own domestic industry and you want to sort of give them maybe a 20-year head start. But I think the broader picture should be, and I think this is where the Modi government did try, but maybe they need to now rethink how to do it in a more intelligent way, where you build up such a deep economic relationship with China, where that actually becomes an important source of leverage to look at it from the broader perspective. Because if you look at what the United States and China, why are Chinese afraid to escalate into a confrontation? Because they are so dependent on globalization. They're so dependent on trade with the US and its allies. So can we also emulate some of that and benefit from that? I think that's where the challenge lies. So I would look at, you look at, let's say, Indian students going to China. They have, I think, 20,000 odd, right, Ananth? So maybe we need to look at globalization from a slightly smarter perspective, that we're not going to build walls again, but we're going to actually find some areas where we need to go deeper into Asia. Because I think Asian economy today has China as part of it. And if you are going to play any role in this broader Indo-Pacific, this Quad, that question, Quad has to be more than just navies floating around and doing some exercises. There has to be something more meaningful happening. our supply chains, joint production, going and developing infrastructure. There's so many areas. And I think that's where the story of India's deeper integration with Asia will come. So I'd leave it on a message where we need openness, but maybe not the neoliberal kind of openness where you just open the frontiers, open the borders and let everything sort of come in and out, because that might just not allow you to build up your power. So, but openness in a smarter fashion. And dare I say, maybe we can learn something from the Chinese. So, Ananth, any final thoughts? And maybe
No, I
hand it
leave
over
the final
the
word to you.
organizers?
Yeah, I just wanted
Yeah.
to say thank you all. It was a real pleasure, and I would hand it back to our host for any
Thank you.
final
Ananth.
words.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you
was
so
so nice.
much. May I request our senior President, Admiral IJS Khurana Sahab, to give the vote of thanks, please, to the two eminent authors who made our evening so eventful. Admiral Khurana Sahab.
So Hindaji, we need a 2.0 of this, another session with these gentlemen. That was so
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you all for making it happen.
Yeah, really it was. Very, very
They have spread a very wide canvas. They have told us from the times immemorial. But as you well know, that the Chinese mind is Chinese checkers. I don't think anyone can really forecast what they really have in mind. And they are saying some very good things. I agree with them. But what I see as a military man happening is that there are going to be, if not NATO, CENTOs and SEATOs, there are going to be quads and 2 or 3 times the quads too. So this is a very peculiar situation. And one has to be careful because Chinese are an autocratic government. And I don't think there is enough freedom. They have their own problems of Uyghurs, South China Sea, and the latest meeting they had at the Anchorage was enough to indicate where the sides are pitted against each other. Now, what I can see now, whether Russia, what part the Russia plays in all this. But I think the canvas, the way they spread it, the way they explained it with their vast experience, with their deep knowledge, it was a very interesting evening spent. I would thank both Zorawar and Ananth for an excellent exposition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you once again for being with us and making our evening so eventful. And may I request you all to please stand up for the national anthem. The meeting is adjourned. Please stand up for the national anthem. Rajiv, the national anthem, please. Hello. Rajiv, can you hear me? Rajiv, please, national anthem.
Minute, please. There are
Some
some
great
there are
singers
some-
in the club. So Hindaji, we have great singers. Let somebody sing.
You can lead.
just one thing, sorry.
I can sing if you allow me, Sundarji.
Yes, yes, of course.
Jan Gan Man Adhinayak
अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much
Thank you.
with us. Thank you.
Lovely.
A great evening.
Thank you, Zorawar. Really appreciate
Thank you so much. Thank you again. Really honored. Thank you. Have a good evening.
And Ananth Krishnan and Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh, thank you so much. What a great evening. Thank you.
Good
Thank
to
you.
see Sanjeev.
The lot we learned. a
You're
lot.
from San Francisco. You made it in time, as they say, huh?
Yes.